And that's another thing to note, actually, on this topic. Sinkholes. Sinkholes. Baba Yanun pointed out to us that a lot of the sinkholes we've seen in recent times were a result of extraterrestrials beneath the surface looking up. Like, nah, it's time to go. It's time to go. What's about to happen on this planet? It's time to get out of here. So the sinkholes that we've seen in recent times, and that's why I say, when we go back to Shambhala and Agartha, and I spoke about depictions of some of the beings that were living beneath the surface, I don't know if those beings are still there. Just to note that, I don't know. A lot of the beings have left. Not to say there's no one living beneath the surface now, but a lot of those beings were like, nice, we're out. And that has me worried. Like, what's about to happen?
Gotta think, what's about to happen? That there was like, we're out of here.
We're out. It's time to go. Because in that book, Baba explains some of these beings are advanced, more advanced than humans. So, you know, it's like, yeah, they got technologies, they've mastered it beyond what we've mastered, so on and so forth. So they're like, oh, it's time to go. Damn. But that ties into topics like the end times, the end of the world, so on and so forth, which we have to dive into. But yeah, a lot of them have gone. So sinkholes in the last 2 decades, just to note that, yeah, that was what it was. What it is some of the time is a result of these extraterrestrials leaving wherever they were at, if that makes sense. So,
and some of them sinkholes were pretty big.
Yeah,
really big.
Appeared out of nowhere as well. So yeah.
But you can't drop the end of the world and then just not say anything about that. You know?
I thought we was going to do a whole episode on it. A whole episode is required.
Well, we are, because that is, we're actually going to do an episode called The End of the World. But we got to touch on something.
Something, yeah. I mean, what I would say about the end of the world is there's so many things to say and so many books to read on this topic. I think one of the fundamental things to understand about it is that, because, you know, it was, like you say, it was trending. Obviously, in recent years, it's been trending. The last decade or so, even more. Because 2012, a lot of people thought, yeah, it's the end. Everything's gone. I was reading some things. I remember I was younger back then, so I was reading on the internet. How they're saying this? Is it going to happen? You know, you start getting worried.
All the projections.
Yeah,
and the movie didn't help.
Yeah, the 2012, the movie. I'm watching it like, what are we going to do? We need to get to work. We need to build some submarines or whatever. So it's trending. But what I would say is that one of the fundamental things to understand about the end of the world or the end times is that it is not the end, so to speak, in that format, because existence oscillates. It vibrates. So we bounce between life and death, and one is required for the other. So anything that is about to take place or is taking place, because we are in the end times, literally, look around. Viruses, wars, sinkholes, earthquakes, natural disasters of all sorts, of all kinds. We are literally in the end times right now. And one thing to note is that anything that is happening or going to happen, it has happened before many times and will happen again many times. And Baba Yanun has been teaching us that for quite some time. So we go back to one thing that they're looking at now is that people are looking into the fact that something happened 12,000 years ago. Scientists and geologists are like, yeah, we think something hit the planet about 12,000 years ago. Baba Yanun's been telling us that for quite some time. And this is why he splits the cycles of this world into 4 sections of 6,000 years. So every 24,000 years is a rebirth, but every 12,000 years, something happens. Every 6,000 years, something happens. This ties into what we were speaking about the other day, where we mentioned when you're looking at the biblical creation story, it goes back about 6,000 years, doesn't it? So that was a creation. Something happened 6,000 years ago, but that wasn't the beginning, so to speak. Existence is without beginning, without end. And certainly when you talk about the planet's beginnings, they go back far longer than 6,000 years. And that's generally well accepted. You know, you hear terms like, probably numbers like 4.5 million years old, 5.4, those type of numbers. So everything that is happening and is going to happen has happened already, if that makes sense. And hence why you see them like, okay, yeah, 12,000 years ago, something happened. We think at first they weren't sure. They knew something happened because there was a change that they couldn't explain in the planet, but they weren't sure what had caused it. There's a book called The Lost Records of Time, and there's a book called Atlantis.
Yeah.
And in the book, but in those books, Baba Yanun explains that, yeah, okay, about 12,000 years ago, a meteorite hit the planet, right? It's actually the reason that Atlantis sunk, if that makes sense. And there's another book called Is Egyptian Ontology or Mythology, which explains the whole story. That's a little bit separate, but of Atlantis, or as we called it in our tones, Utla, if that makes sense, which later became Atlantis because the Greeks loved their Isis and their Oss and so on and so forth. So everything's got Jesus, Atlantis, Osiris, Horus. They love that. They love that sound. So everything, but you can trace all those tones back to our tones, if that makes sense, if you know how to do so. So that's a good book for that. But what the point I'm getting at is that when you're dealing with the end of the world, it's something that happens over and over again, because every so often there has to be a rebirth or a recycle or a recreation. And in order for a rebirth, you need death, you need destruction. So as scary as it can sometimes be as a human living on the planet, going through it, such a time period is necessary for existence. Yeah. And we see it. We have to remember we live very short lives in comparison to the planet. So, but we can see examples of it within our lifetime. What happens every single year? Everything dies and then everything comes back to life. You have your winter time, you have your springtime. That's just nature, right? And we see it and we witness it. And so the planet must do the same thing. The solar system, the universe must do the same thing. At some point, it must die, so to speak, so they can be reborn. And this is what the Bennu bird is symbolic of. That rebirth. Again, phoenix, taken from the Bennu bird. That rebirth, that catching fire and burning and then coming out of the ashes. So that's one thing I would say about the end of the world, is that we can talk specifically about what's happened on specific dates. So 2012 was a specific date. Something did happen, which actually pertains, ironically, to the central sun, if that makes sense. So we can dive into that. There's a book called The Precession Change, which explains exactly what happens every 12,000 years, exactly what happens every 24,000 years, precession, equinoxes, so on and so forth. So we can deal with the cycles, but the fundamental thing that I would want people to understand about the end of the world is that it's happened before and it will happen again. And it's not the end of the world in its entirety, it's the end of a world, if that makes sense. And as beings of African descent, I'm not saying, we should be smiling, but maybe we should be smiling, because when we look at the last age of existence, it hasn't been a great one for us. And so we're looking at it like, okay, yeah, it's time for a recycle, just revamp this up, if that makes sense. But that doesn't mean work isn't required. But the end of the world is all about who is going to come out on the other side of this destruction period. So I've mentioned a few books to read, and hopefully I can dive into exactly why you should read them. The Lost Records of Time, Atlantis, good books. Is Egyptian Ontology or Mythology, good books. 3-part of that scrolls. One is called The Flood, and then you have I Was There, which is here, part 1 and part 2, where Baba Yanun literally walks you through previous cycles of the very things that are happening right now, from this year, from 2012 leading up to 2030. If that makes sense. And we know what, as beings, obviously we know what we're expecting. There's various books that have told us what to expect, but we understand that we are in the end times. But that's what I would say, without diving into specifics, which we have to do. So the end of the world is the end of a world. A world must die and something else will be reborn in its place. And we just have to look at it and decide if we're going to be a part of that, of what's reborn, which ties in on so many levels. So yeah, I mean, I could go on and on, but yeah, we required an entire episode to speak about exactly what's happening and what we should be doing as a people because of it, if that makes sense. And everything that we're saying ties into it. We're not telling people it's important to understand who created you just for fun. It ties into it. You need to know who created you, because it is those beings that have a plan for us. We're not telling people to learn our language just for fun. You need to be able to communicate and understand the beings that are responsible for us. And this all ties in because it is our ancestors or our overseers who are responsible for this planet. And so they have seen many rebirths, many deaths, so to speak, or end of the world, so to speak, and rebirth. They've seen many of them, which is why I say read scrolls like The Flood I was there, which was here, where Baba Yaga explains, yeah, okay, yeah, this is what happened. This is what happened in the last cycle. This is what happened in the cycle before that, so on and so forth. So, yeah, that's the message I would put across. Yeah, it's the end of a world. So we're going to be a part of the new world, if that makes sense, because it is coming. It is happening. It is happening.
We're in the end game now.
Yeah, we are in the end game now, literally. Look around, man. You can see. We can see. So you'd have to be, which is very easy to be. It's not even a criticism, but you'd have to be in denial to not acknowledge it. And sometimes denial is just the easiest place to be. You know, I'm looking now and seeing this and seeing that. I can't deal with it. Let's do this. But this is the reality. And so Baba Yanon's always been about the reality. And he gives it to us and he lets us know. Sometimes we hear things and we're like, oh, really?
Yeah.
But reality is reality. So we're living in a great time and a difficult time at the same time.
Exactly. When you spoke about denial, that reminded me of Cypher, and it was talking about Matrix. Yeah. Matrix is the one we compare to a lot.
Yeah, Matrix is it's a deep film.
Cypher was like, ignorance is bliss. Take me back to the Matrix.
Yeah. He didn't want to remember nothing. He was like, nah. And we've seen that. And that's what I'm saying. When you're dealing with these, Matrix is such a brilliant movie. What I would say is take that and apply it to life as well, because it is a reality. When you're dealing with concepts like the Matrix, it is a reality. You have the concept of anyone can be an agent, right? It's a reality. We are plugged into a system whereby our lives are not in our own hands. So I want to dive into that. Maybe we'll do that next segment, but it's a reality. I'd say apply it to reality because it's real, if that makes sense. But yeah, denial is sometimes easier. It's sometimes easier, which is what you see on so many levels. We spoke about religion. We spoke about the system. Sometimes it's just easier to just go with, okay, this is what's been written. I'm just going to go with this. It's easier. If I have to acknowledge that fact, that requires a fight in me. I got to fight for that. You know, I got to acknowledge that we've been tortured, or we've been this, or we've been, or we've fallen. I've got to acknowledge some truths that are difficult to acknowledge. So I'll just go with this. And sometimes it's just easier.